Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Well, I appreciate you joining me, Dr. Raymond Tallis. This is an honor. I know that a lot of people probably want your attention, and you've been writing, I think, almost 39 books. So you're a busy human being, and you've been just enamored with the curiosity about the nature of consciousness for many years. And I've been listening to you speak for quite some time, and I've got your book, The Defense of Wonder, In Defense of Wonder.
Yeah.
And that is the theme of this podcast. It's a Wonder Junkie podcast. So a lot of my guests are exploring the nature of consciousness and from different perspectives. And anyway, I'd love to just delve into who you are and how you got so enamored in writing so many books. That takes a lot of energy. So what is the underlying drive for you?
Well, I think it goes back a long way. I mean, there's positive drives and negative drives. I can remember when I was a teenager, I was overcome by a strange sense of the world being unreal. It was the most curious sort of feeling, and it would occur from time to time. And also was terribly aware of my mortality. And those were the drivers that put me in the direction of philosophy, even though my main interest and preoccupation was medicine. And so that's what really triggered me. And these strange feelings that I had, I thought, gosh. And then I discovered a year or so later that, in fact, they actually were the curriculum, at least in part, for philosophy. So I was really quite pleased to realize I was in such elevated company. So that's really how I got into philosophy, really the questions that asked me rather than me asking questions.
And it seems like your general philosophy is you call yourself a humanist, and it seems like you're just driven in life by a passionate curiosity and to be in wonder. Is that correct?
It absolutely is. And also, in particular, to remind myself, and through reminding myself, reminding other people of what utterly extraordinary, strange, mysterious creatures we human beings are, and untaking for granted what we would normally regard as ordinary, everyday life. I mean, we are astonishing creatures. The world we've created collectively and individually is absolutely astonishing. And at least in part of my philosophy is some of it's answering questions, but a lot of it is just celebration, driven by wonder, hence in defense of wonder.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And it seems like there's a lot of existential components to how you approach this, which I feel like, and you do too, it seems, that's trying to be the subjective part of the human experience seems to be being stripped away by the scientific community.
Yeah.
And it's like Sapolsky and many others are trying to defend the idea and to solidify the idea that we don't have free will. And it seems so hard to do that because consciousness is such a mystery, and so is biology, and so is the nature of the universe that we're a part of. And there's always this idea that we have a grand unified theory about the nature of consciousness or about the nature of the universe. And if you just sit quietly for just 10 minutes with yourself and even look at a beautiful landscape, or think about the fact that we're sitting here. I was thinking on a bike ride this morning that Socrates and Aristotle and different folks, if we could actually go back through time and show them just a moment of what you and I are doing in this moment, speaking through screens from across the world, it would blow their mind, and it would almost seem quite magical and impossible. And these types of things are where the awe and the wonder and the mystery drive me. And it always seems that the more I learn about the nature of consciousness and the universe, which are not separate, it leaves me more and more in humility. And it makes me even realize, like, God, we could never actually have a grand unified theory of any of this stuff because we're looking at it through such a limited lens. So anyway, that's where I wanted to start with this conversation, is this curiosity and the wonder and how weird it is.
And you've already flagged up two items which I hope we'll discuss.
Mm-hmm.
One is Sapolsky and free will and determinism, and I hope we have a chance to talk about that. And the second is the scientific vision of ourselves, and whether there will ever be a grand unified theory that incorporates the theorist as well as the universe that it tries to describe. So I'm very much looking forward to talking about those two agenda items when they come up.
Yeah, and your new book that's coming out, circling around explicitness, the heart of the mystery of human being. I'd love to get into some of that because obviously you've been just hyper focused on writing this book, and that pretty much gets into what we're talking about. Like, what is explicit when it comes to consciousness?
Well, of course, consciousness has many layers. Essentially, there's sentience, which we probably share with non-human animals. There's perception when we're aware of objects that are outside of us, other than us, and that have properties of their own. And then there are other modes of consciousness. Thoughts, of course, which have as their intentional objects things that aren't necessarily present. When we entertain possibilities, which we articulate sometimes in linguistic form, emotions, theories, and so on. So our consciousness and our sense of explicitness is many-layered. And it might be worthwhile just picking up on why I've chosen explicitness when it comes to looking at consciousness, why I'm looking at consciousness through the lens of explicitness. Might be worthwhile, I guess, offering your listeners a definition.
Absolutely.
I mean, what is explicitness?
Yeah.
Well, it's a transition. It's a transition from what is, whatever it is, to that it is. And this sense that things are, that there is a world, that there is a universe, is really central to consciousness. And it has many layers, as I said, and its climactic, or its topmost layer, is our sense of the universe. I mean, we're incredibly cheeky beasts. We actually put the universe in inverted commas. I mean, what chutzpah, you know, we think we can talk about the universe. But essentially, explicitness is about the transition, or making explicit is the transition from whatever is, what is, to that it is. Our awareness, our understanding, our exploration, our cognitive exploration, and so on. And it's that which is often overlooked, particularly in scientific accounts of consciousness.
Yeah, and you were telling me in your email exchange a few weeks ago that we would get into chapter 3 in particular, and it's mainly focused on the idea that the brain is the source of consciousness, and it seems that a lot of the neuroscience has done that recently, where we are so obsessed with focusing on the brain as the thing that's generating consciousness, but we know that now the gut and the whole heart system, and we just can't really know that it's in the brain. So anyway, can we get into that?
Most certainly can, yes. In fact, this is a story that goes a long way to when I was a medical student at Oxford, and my poor tutor had to listen to me disputing whether or not we could explain consciousness by activity in the brain, neural activity. Does your consciousness really boil down to ionic discharges along neurons? Does your self just consist of patterns of ionic discharges along neurons? And it seems to me that is highly unlikely. So I deal with this in the third chapter of Circling Round Explicitness and challenge the notion of the brain as the brewery of explicitness, and I don't think it is. And there are many reasons that one can invoke for saying that. The most obvious is that consciousness is something that reaches out. If, for example, I'm seeing you now, how am I seeing you? Well, directly or indirectly, there are obviously light waves going from your body into my eye and ticketing up my visual pathways. So there's a straightforward causal chain there. What isn't the straightforward causal chain is that whatever's happening in my brain, if that was the explanation of my awareness of you, whatever's happening in my brain actually then reaches out and becomes aware of you. So you can explain the light coming in and tickling up my visual pathways by straightforward causal connections, how the light gets in, but how the gaze looks out. So I am looking at you, and indeed you're looking at me. That can't be explained in that kind of way. So consciousness really isn't something that you can understand as wired into the causal network of the material universe. So the brain, which is part of that causal network of the material universe cannot account for consciousness. And actually, you mentioned other organs that might be involved, and certainly the so-called enactivists try and explain consciousness by thinking of the whole body being involved. But I don't think that quite delivers either. Quite a lot of our body is rather sort of low-grade giblets, frankly. I don't want to be rude about the body, but I'm a smorgasbord of giblets in one sense, and they don't really seem to offer much in the way of explanation of consciousness. So, for a long time, I've been criticizing the notion that consciousness, our capacity to make things explicit, including ourselves, I've challenged the notion that consciousness is simply an effect that takes place in the brain as a result of stimuli of various sorts landing on it. And perhaps if we have time, we can talk about how those who are aware of the difficulties of the neural theory of consciousness try and wriggle out of it and take the strain off the brain, but still claim that the brain does the business. But perhaps we can come to that in due course.
Yeah, I'd love to go into how people keep trying to wiggle out of that in a way, because it's very complex. And you, as a doctor, used to work with stroke patients, if I'm correct, right? And so
Absolutely, yes.
you put somebody in a brain scanner and you start to look at where the bleed is or the clot is. And there's a lot of truth behind the fact that the brain has so much to do with consciousness, obviously. But what about the rest of the body being in, there's not a way to separate the body and the mind. And there's not a way to separate the environment from the mind either, or the brain, right? And so this becomes a little bit of a problem because there's so much influence between the environment, the body, the brain, and what we've seemed to do in this today's day and age, at least, is to separate everything into these little categories and to isolate and look at one body part or one element when it comes to anything. And from the people I've spoken to that are biologists, developmental biologists, they're helping me to see just the cliff notes of their work because they're obviously so enamored in this deep field, but they help me to see the complexities of biology even, and how
Absolutely.
Physics and biology in comparison to one another, physics is almost like, one of them said, Andrew Marino goes, it's doo-doo compared to biology, just because it's so oversimplified and so limited as far as our perception of it. But when you get into the body, it's so interactive with so many variables that you could never isolate it down and measure one little variable without having a whole bunch of other things come to play as a question.
Absolutely. Well, just picking up, I'm very glad you made the point that clearly there are reasons for obviously thinking that the brain has some role in consciousness. As a stroke doctor, I was terribly aware not only that you could lose consciousness as a result of brain injury, but specific conscious functions can be damaged by injury in different parts of the brain. You can make some very close correlations, say between the loss of the capacity to recognize faces, for example, and damage to a particular part of the brain, the occipital pole. What does that tell you, though? Does that tell you that what goes on the brain is identical with consciousness? Now, what it says, it is a necessary condition of consciousness, but it isn't either a sufficient condition of consciousness, and you've mentioned other parts of the body that are necessary, nor is it identical with consciousness. So, of course, if you chop my head off, my IQ certainly falls, no, without doubt. Or if I have a severe brain injury, I lose a lot of aspects of my conscious function. But that just shows that the brain is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, and it doesn't show that what goes on in the brain is identical with consciousness. There are philosophers, of course, say, yes, well, in fact, I think we can solve this problem. And what they do is they, if you like, try to change the way we think about what goes on in the material world. So a particular philosophical position that I've argued against is what I call pan-informationalism. This is the idea that everything that happens in the universe is essentially a transmission of information. Some physicists have said this, but quite a few philosophers have said that when an entity interacts with another entity, there's an exchange of information. Well, that, of course, to me is nonsense. it overlooks the fact that information is something that has to be made explicit, or events have to be made explicit to a conscious being in order to become information. So we can set aside pan-informationalism. But then I guess there's another approach, which you may be aware of, called panpsychism. I don't know whether it rings a bell with you.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I do my usual...
Where everything is conscious in the universe.
Exactly. And how do the panpsychists arrive at this conclusion? Well, they say essentially, number one, we can't see the consciousness in most of the universe because our observations, and indeed our scientific observations, look at what things do, not what they are intrinsically. But they say there is one entity which is an exception to this, which is our own brains. I know my own brain from the inside, if you like, and you know what? My brain is conscious, from which I can infer that when you know things from the inside, rather than looking at them from the outside, how they interact with other things, then you can see that they are conscious. So they come to the conclusion that consciousness is universal. And suddenly the brain doesn't have quite as much of a job to do because there's consciousness everywhere. It's there in electrons and so on and so forth. That's panpsychism. There are huge problems with panpsychism. Here's a couple. One is if every single entity in the universe, right down to electrons, is conscious, how does this consciousness add up to a coherent, conscious subject like you or me, who has a self, a story, and so on and so forth? And the other is, if, as has been suggested, consciousness is universal and there's only a single universal consciousness, cosmopsychism, you say, well, how does that universal consciousness break up into individual conscious subjects like Ryan and Ray and so on? So panpsychism is a mess, pan-informationalism is a mess. So all these endeavors to take the strain off the brain, I'm afraid, don't really work. And we're left with being unable to explain consciousness in purely neurological terms. And I say this, as you pointed out, someone who's been involved in neuroscience for the whole of my career.
Yeah. I love that you can combine neuroscience, though, with philosophy, with poetry, and with, this ability to mix the fields. I think that's one of the things, at least I'm noticing, is this inability for different fields to cross-pollinate and to mix with each other and to start thinking about how you can't separate the fields even. I mean, you have to at some degree to study it, but like biophysics and looking at quantum biology and quantum physics and starting to wonder what that relationship is. And I think it's a beautiful thing that now those fields are starting to cross-pollinate more and more, like Michael Levin's work. But yeah, I almost feel like one of the issues I'm noticing with the human condition is that we always want to have certainty. We don't like uncertainty, even though the scientific community says that, they're okay with it. It seems that they're really not. Most scientists are human, so they're trying to orient towards having this answer and to refine things down and have the answer. And sometimes what happens, at least from what I've gathered, is that things get far more interesting and you have way more questions, but you could never really refine things down because we are having some sort of subjective experience that intertwines with all of this. The subjectivity is really missing, and I think people don't give it enough power. What do you think of this, the subjectivity and the existential component?
I agree with you entirely, and I wanted first to pick up on something you said earlier, which is about the complexity of biology compared with physics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at the nearest we've got to a theory of everything, it's probably general relativity. And it's obviously, excuse me, captured in that famous equation, E equals mc squared. But that is a total emptying of the universe. Basically, it says that there's not even a differentiation between matter and energy. They boil down to the same, or they quantitatively boil down to the same. And one of the problems, I think, with science is that it strips everything down to how much. Basically, it reduces what is to quantities. And it brings me back to what you were saying earlier, which is about the extraordinary things we can do. And we can do them through science. I'm not ungrateful to science. You and I are talking across, I don't know how many thousand miles, a lot of thousand miles. And I imagine 100 years ago, I popped up my hand and said, do you know, in 100 years' time, I'll be able to talk to this chap, Ryan, in Arizona without even raising my voice. I might just use a little thing that I hold in my hand. And people would say, help him out, out of the hall. He'll be all right in a minute, and so on and so forth. So there's no doubt about what science delivers through reducing things to quantities. But what physics doesn't do is give us metaphysics, and it strips everything of the richness of the world, the richness that's evident in biology, and the richness that we can see in everyday life. You mentioned my interest in poetry. I've published quite a lot of poetry because it's a kind of correction of the gaze. The synoptic gaze, which has a wider and wider look, can rather overlook. So if I'm talking about matter and mind, not very tasty really. It's lost all its specific detailed contents. So for poetry, one wants to look at things. What Blake talked about was the holiness of minute particulars. I'm a humanist, but I do believe in the holiness of minute particulars. So there is that need to descend from the wider gaze, which looks so wide that it overlooks pretty well everything by the time you got to E equals mc squared, and to focus on individual things. Yeah.
And what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to this overlook? And like what would be different if we humans started to change our lens and start to see things a little bit more alive and animate when it comes to the interactivity and the fluidity of it, because it seems like it's a living process. It's a happening. So it's hard to actually, measure something that's alive, and we're alive inside of it in real time. I've always thought of this, and like we're looking at space through telescopes, which is incredible that we can increase our lens. But if you sit back on a chair on a beautiful starry night where there's no moon, and you just get curious, you can see and feel and have this existential experience that there's absolutely 100% no way that any human being could ever conceive of the true nature of reality. At least I'm pretty certain about that. Whenever I get down to what's actually true, that's the first thing that's true, is that we have no idea what this is, which makes it far more beautiful and interesting. And that's the awe and the mystery. So how different would human beings be if we started to encapsulate that first as first principle thinking and infusing that back into the science?
Gosh, what a good question. I mean, I think what you've described is how we do encounter things anyway. When we see other people and fall in love with them, when we get fascinated by landscapes, etc., etc. All of that is essentially how we really do experience things. But what, as the certain philosophers who reduce metaphysics to physics say, well, actually, it all boils down to, and then E equals mc squared, or some theory of everything that will bring together quantum mechanics and general relativity and so on. And you get to say to someone like Stephen Weinstein, incredible physicist, as you know, but he said that essentially the more we get to know the universe, the more meaningless it is. No, Stephen, it's not at all. What it means is the more you forget of the universe in order to be able to see all of it at once, so you erase details, then of course it becomes meaningless. Mm-hmm. But actually, it isn't meaningless. And there are endless sources of meaning, and some of them are not good meanings. I mean, toothache is a pretty powerful source of meaning. It's sort of pretty engrossing. And of course, there are other more wonderful sources of meaning. Yeah. So I guess in answer to your question, one way of, as it were, embracing everyday ordinary life is not to feel haunted by the idea that when you look through it with the aid of physics or whatever, it's pretty empty, etc. No, there are surfaces and depths that are really cannot be overlooked, denied, and so on. I mean, actually, if E equals mc squared were really a description of the universe, it wouldn't be much of a tourist destination, would it? You wouldn't pay much to go there. And which is not to say E equals mc squared isn't the most wonderful product of the human mind. Yeah.
Can you drill into the E equals mc squared in relationship to what the time issue is and like how we perceive of time and how it would be impossible to fit the subjectivity and the nature of reality into this equation? Can you go a little bit further into this?
Yes, well, of course, as the equation, it means energy equals mass times the velocity of light squared. And already think, what a strange thing to do. You extract from light its velocity, and as if that's not cheeky enough, in order to get your sums right, you multiply the velocity of light by itself. What a strange thing to do. It is a very, very strange equation. And what it has done, it has drained everything out of what is, apart from quantities. So all the light is present as is not as a source of illumination. It's present there to provide its velocity. And it's there, or its velocity is there, because it's something that is an invariant. And it is not susceptible to changes in frames of reference and so on.
Yeah, and what do you think about, God, there's a lot to unpack when you start to conceive of this, I suppose. But like the ancient Greeks and different people that came up with different ways of thinking about the nature of consciousness in relationship to, say, Stoicism and things like this that emerged, where we had this meaning-making element to it. And now, when you just said a minute ago that people have this reductionist mindset to say that once we learn more and more about the nature of the universe, it means that there's no meaning at all because we become, and I've never understood that. I've always thought the more we learn about it, the bigger and more interesting it gets, which creates more of our capacity to choose the meaning that we give to it. It's a relationship to it that is ours to make. It's not, and the one that they're seeming to put onto it is that there's no meaning, but that's a shitty choice in my opinion. You know, it's like a very weird way to look at it. But I mean, I respect it. I just don't understand it.
No, exactly. And actually, I'm thinking you're probably familiar with this famous quote from Pascal when he said, "The eternal silence of the infinite spaces terrifies me." And one of my favorite poets, Paul Valery, said, well, actually, in my case, I'm not particularly terrified because I'm quite distracted by the hubbub in the corner just next to me. And it's kind of, we live in a locality, we live in a parish, and we mustn't think that we should be ashamed of living in a parish because all the complexity and the depth and the richness and the heterogeneity and variety is to be found in parishes. Just as when you were talking earlier on, the transition from physics to biology, what richness comes in then, when you transit to biology. And
Yeah, I don't know where to pivot from here because you did write a book, Aping Mankind, the Neuromania Element and the Darwinitis. Can we talk a little bit about this neuromania? Because we've been touching on it a little bit with the reductionist mindset of the brain, and then we'll get into the Darwinitis. And I'd like to hear about your perspectives on that.
Well, neuromania says basically you are your brain. And if you want to understand Ryan, basically just have a peer at his brain and see what's going on. Have a peer in the intracranial darkness with the use of functional magnetic resonance imaging or whatever, and you'll find out more about Ryan than you could ever find out by other means. And of course, that is nonsense. The whole context of our conversation isn't something that could be encompassed or discovered by looking at the brain, looking at sodium and potassium ions passing through semipermeable membranes. So neuromania is about reducing people to their brains. Neuroscience, fantastic. Made small contributions to it myself, so I have no quarrel with it. Perhaps we can move on to Darwinitis. Would you be okay with that? Because that's another of my preoccupation.
Please, that would be great.
First of all, I have no problem with Darwin. And the extraordinary thing about Darwin's theory of evolution is that it's come stronger in the light of all sorts of technologies and discoveries that have happened since 1859, when The Origin of Species was published. Carbon dating, DNA, looking at DNA, you think there's discovering continental shift and so on. There's so many amazing discoveries, and all they've done is strengthen the case for Darwinian evolution. So Darwinian evolution is very good explaining, say, the transition from unicellular organisms right through to very complex organisms like higher primates and so on and so forth. What it doesn't explain is the transition to persons. So I'm very happy to be seen in terms of my being an organism as totally explained by the evolutionary process, so far as explanation occurs at the moment. There have been new tweaks, of course, with epigenetics and so on. But I'm sorry to say that I'm not just an organism. I am basically a person. And you cannot explain persons in Darwinian terms. And that's really where I feel that we move from Darwinism, okay, to an inflamed state of Darwinism, otherwise known as Darwinitis. Does that make sense to you? Is that sort of
A little bit, and it makes me curious about, say, the subjectivity which we're not able to conceive of other animals and other things like an octopus or something like that. I wonder, like, what it's like to be something, and
yeah.
and also like, what are we trying to define when we say consciousness? Is it awareness? Is it? I guess, what is your theory on the nature of like what is consciousness?
I mean, one can describe aspects of it, can't one? When one imagines in inverted commas lower organisms, there's simply sentience. Then there's actual perception, awareness of objects out there. And that I feel is probably most of the consciousness of most non-human organisms. What makes us different is that we have thoughts which basically entertain possibilities that may or may not exist. We also exist in tensed time. We have very complex memories. For example, I can remember reading the email that you sent me, and that's quite a complex memory. First of all, I remember the email. Secondly, I remember the fact that I read it. And thirdly, I situate the fact that I was reading it in the past tense of myself. It doesn't seem likely that non-human animals have any significant past tense in that way. Nor, incidentally, do they have much in the way of a future tense. There's a lovely quote from the philosopher Wittgenstein when he said that a dog may fear that his master may beat him, but not that he may beat him tomorrow. They don't have that sense of a structured, articulated future, which we have. I mean, you and I made an appointment to talk, and it's, I can't remember how long ago it was, 2 or 3 weeks or whatever. And that sense of time being structured into the future is not something that animals appear to have. And of course, we populate the future with possibilities, not with things that have happened or things that are happening, but things that might happen. And it's our capacity to entertain possibilities that is absolutely central to our distinctive human nature.
What are some of the critiques of this idea that you hear a lot in your field or from people that argue against it and try to take away from the significant component of being human?
Well, a lot of people basically try and collapse the distance between us and other animals, particularly between us and our nearest primate kin, chimpanzees and gorillas and so on. But I've always thought that, use the phrase, by their fruits shall ye know them. And it seems to me that primates don't have the kind of complex world that we have, which has a whole landscape of artifacts. It has institutions, it has modes of collaboration, it has making appointments and all that sort of stuff. That's not at all the life of even our nearest primate kin. They are that their lives are empty compared with ours. They're not stretched out in time. I mean, here's an example. What's the greatest achievement of a chimpanzee 5 million years ago? Probably to break a nut with a rock. Oh, well, we could do that 5 million years ago. Oh, so what can chimpanzees do now? They can break a nut with a rock. Meanwhile, human beings are creating, for good or ill, nuclear power or whatever, and so on. So, I mean, the world we have created is evidence of our different kind of consciousness. The fact that we've woven a world out of possibilities and so on. This is the fundamental difference between what it's like to be a chimp and what it's like to be Ryan, basically.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the newer phenomena that we've evolved is language, and how weird that makes us, because we can create story and poetry and write collective knowledge, and then we can travel through space and time in a way by using the language models that we've developed. And then some of the issues with, like, say, ideology, where we can cling to certain ideas, and then that creates the division, and that's why we have warfare and all this complexity of, like, what makes us so weird. It seems like the newest element of language has really made us so different, right?
You're absolutely right. And it seems to me that language has accelerated our moving away from the life of other animals. And of course, writing has accelerated that acceleration. Um, but actually, language is quite a newcomer. And a book I wrote about the hand and the role of the hand in making us different um, really looks back to about 5 million years ago. And language is a parvenu, a relative newcomer. It's possibly 140,000 years old, 200,000 years old. But I think we started moving away from our primate fellows, possibly at least, well, several million years ago. And one of the drivers that pushed us away from the kind of state that primates were in before is the development of the hand. Here's a story. Here's a just so story for you. About 5 million years ago, hominids basically left the woods and the forests for the open savanna. They assumed the upright position, which meant that the vision then became the most important sense. Vision which delivers much more than smell or touch and so on and so forth. But it also, upright position, liberated the hand. And the hand that was liberated has got some important differences from all the other primates. We have a totally opposable thumb. We have fractionated finger movements of our fingers, which is not comparable to other animals. We have saddle joints that make these fingers and thumbs much more versatile. And we have the capacity in particular to use our index fingers in a way that is very distinctive. And all of those things together, it seemed to me, started a process by which we began drifting further away from the kind of state of nature in which we find chimpanzees and so on. It changed our relationship to our own bodies. Our hand became a tool, or Aristotle described it as the tool of tools. It also meant that we became tool makers long before we acquired language. I mean, pebble choppers and so on, 2 million years, etc. So language, incredibly important. Written language, 2 or 3,000 years old, very, very important, accelerating the process. But the first thing, I think, was probably a biological change, our being liberated from being on all fours, freeing the hand to be an organ of communication, of manipulation, and of cognition.
Mm. I guess I'd never really thought about that, the freeing of the hand. And I don't think I had come across, I've heard you talk about pointing and things of that when it came to the hand and how important that is. But I'm sure you're very familiar with this theory and don't resonate with it probably, but the interactive of psychoactive plants that humans have engaged with and other animals do too, that maybe possibly had something to do with influencing the development of the brain and the doubling of the brain size, and maybe that influenced art and language. But I don't know if that's true.
I mean, to me, it's quite plausible. Like, you can imagine that if you have extraordinary visions as a result of psychedelic drugs or whatever, that can extend your sense of possibility.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone's ever asked, at least I've never heard, have you ever had a psychedelic experience?
Well, I mean, I do a bit of Pinot Grigio. That's my.
That's a non-ordinary state, right?
Well, actually, when I have Pinot Grigio, I move into a parallel world where my jokes are funny and people are laughing at my jokes rather than me. But that's very much a parallel world. No, I've never tried psychedelic drugs. And I'm not too sure why. Perhaps the fear of helplessness if the thing got completely out of control, but also whether or not I would believe what I experienced. You know, people come back from taking psychedelic drugs with all sorts of reports that everything is one and so on and so forth, but they still rely on the world as we take it in everyday life in order to be quite safe. And one can imagine a situation where a person takes, I don't know what, psilocybin or whatever, thinks everything is one, trips over the cat, falls down the stairs, sets fire to the house. My God, we've got to get the fireman now. And suddenly we have to be back to Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, where we've got people fixing your legs and putting out the fire in your house and so on and so forth. So in many ways, there's a kind of insincerity, if you see what I mean, saying, suddenly I've seen all is one and oops-a-daisy and, 999 or whatever, 111.
Yeah. No, that's a good answer. I've always been curious about them, and I've just, the more you read history and you find out that so many cultures were engaging with them in such a unique way. It wasn't usually just done in a frivolous way. It was some sort of rites of passage or initiatory experiences, things like that, and then how it's actually shaped culture and created a lot of the religions and a lot of the other stuff. So it's always been fascinating to me how much it's impacted our culture, all
And I
cultures.
completely resonate to that. I'm sure you're right. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I would love to ask you a bunch of more questions if you don't mind.
Of course. Of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of them was actually just asking you basically, like, what are some of the biggest hangups in the scientific community right now? What do you think some of the issues are? Because some of the things I've seen have been in the medical models and things like this, that they're so influenced by incentives. And so there's all these grants and all these things, and then people are somewhat tongue-tied, or they're not able to write certain papers or speak certain, there's a lot of censorship, if you will, based on finance. And so it starts to drive the science in certain ways and some of the studies in certain directions. Instead of it being somewhat of a free market, it becomes captured by, say, if we want to just look at the medical industry, it's captured so much by big pharma. And so if anyone starts to study something that has a response or an understanding that, say, statins are not healthy, or maybe we shouldn't be taking them, or that they don't actually do well for the body, those studies sometimes don't make it to the surface, or the funding gets stripped. So that's just some of the little things I've seen in the centralized scientific model, but I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the hang-ups in science.
Yes. I mean, there are different hang-ups in different sciences. I mean, physics, the hang-up is such an investment. If I'm talking about fundamental physics now, that if you want to say make further progress in the unification of quantum mechanics and general relativity, you're going to have to invest even more in the kind of massive colliders that have been that enabled us to discover, if we did discover it, the Higgs boson. So really, that involves a huge commitment, and people would be very reluctant, as it were, to step off the bus, having got the thing going. Um, when it comes to medicine, yes, indeed, there is a certain possibility that people's medical research and their medical views will be influenced by non-medical considerations, shall we say. But actually, the progress in medicine has been absolutely fantastic. I qualified as a doctor in 1970 and retired in 2006. During that time, medicine was utterly transformed, whether it was the treatment of high cholesterol. You mentioned statins. I'm on statins actually, but if you mention statins, they've transformed the outlook for people who potentially have cardiovascular disease, management of blood pressure, treatment of infections, etc., etc. So never mind the capacity to investigate the brain, etc., etc. So although there are potentially corrupting influences and influences touching on what you said, that make people rather conservative, they remain within a particular paradigm, I think on the whole, things are progressing pretty well. I mean, I look at the incremental improvement in cancer care. It is just extraordinary. So there are slight reasons for pessimism, but bigger reasons for optimism.
Hmm.
Certainly bigger reasons for optimism than there are in the wider world. And, we seem to be going to hell in a handcart in some respects.
Yeah.
So does that seem a reasonable answer? I mean,
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to hear your perspectives on that. So, and it's good because you do come from that field and you've seen all of the progress. From the outside looking in, sometimes I see like what happened during the pandemic, and there's just certain amounts of censorship that I'm concerned with, and I think a lot of people are, where only one narrative is being heard. And then, when you start to tamper with narrative control, it becomes very dangerous, I think, because there's people that have very sharp minds and there's very smart people out there, but I've even had videos removed from my podcast for having doctors on that talk about cancer from a different vantage point, and it just gets stripped off the internet, and that's concerning to me. I think that that's a real dangerous scenario, you know. And who's the one controlling the narrative? And it's usually driven by AI and algorithmic control now, which is more powerful. So,
I mean, for my own feeling, the thing that should control the narrative is evidence. And I'm a
yep,
complete and total besotted embracer of evidence-based medicine. And getting
absolutely.
evidence is difficult, time-consuming, often tedious. So, for example, the use of statins to treat high cholesterol, the evidence is very good. The evidence for vaccination, for its measles or whatever, is absolutely extraordinary. The number of lives been saved. So, I mean, my only constraint will be that any statements made at least are based on evidence obtained in a way that is scientifically sound.
Yeah, absolutely. So, can you define, you say you're a humanist, can you sort of help people understand? I've heard you say it before, but I'd love to help other people hear what being a humanist really is.
Um, well, I don't embrace the notion of a supernatural origin, either for the whole universe or in specifically that we were handmade by God, God's favorite entity, as it were. So I don't believe in God, but that's a rather negative thing. So I call myself a secular humanist rather than a humanist atheist, because that seems a bit negative. At the same time, I don't think we're just parts of nature. I believe that we are in kind of respects that you were flagging up earlier on, we are extra natural. We go beyond nature. And that's one of the most striking things of ourselves as human beings. I also believe that there is something very important, fundamentally the same about all of us, and that we all have the same rights and the same right to justice, nutrition, or whatever you like. I feel that should be an appropriate aim for us collectively to ensure that all of us individually live a life that's relatively free of suffering. So we are, as it were, there's a metaphysical bit to my humanism, that we
Yeah.
are extra-natural, not supernatural or just piece of nature. And then there's a sort of socio-political bit, which is about how we should be treated and how we should treat each other.
And what do you think about when it comes to free will and meaning making and our ability to do that? Like if you go back through time and you look at different philosophies and existential philosophies, it's very built on meaning making.
Gosh, I'm so glad you asked that question. Early on in our conversation, you mentioned Sapolsky, didn't you?
Yep.
And now, Sapolsky, I reviewed his book called Determined. It was a brilliant book. And at the end of it, I said, I'd really like to congratulate him on this book, except he, of course, can't take credit for it because he doesn't believe he did it through free will. But I have a book, as you probably know, showing in what sense we have free will. And it's worthwhile going through a little bit of the argument. Um, First of all, there seems to be a theoretical case against free will. Um, Everything that happens in the universe, people will say, and that includes things that involve my body and so on, is causally connected with everything else. So if I raise my arm, there must be some kind of causal connection between prior causes. And that causal ancestry goes all the way back to the beginning of the universe, when I wasn't born. So did I have no choice over raising my arm? And it gets worse because there's an even stronger case which says, yes, and what's more, you have to believe in causal connectedness, A, for your actions to be possible. If action and reaction were not equal and opposite, I couldn't get out of bed in the morning.
Hmm.
And secondly, for your actions to have the consequences you anticipate. So it looks like we're absolutely imprisoned. And the idea that you can act freely, it's a bit like Munchausen, when his horse ran into a marsh, saying he lifted himself out of the marsh by pulling on his hair, which is a particular feat for someone like me who's bald. So it looks as if there's quite a problem with understanding free will. But let's step back and let's look at actions as they are in real life. They are motivated by things that don't exist. They're motivated by possibilities, by intentions, by expectations. So, for example, you and I are talking, and in what sense is that a free action? Well, basically, I saw the opportunity to talk to you, and so ordered my affairs, so we could fill that opportunity. And actions are also um, quite difficult from other happenings. So, for example, I spent many years trying to improve stroke services for people in the UK, and all the elements of that, whether it was a trip down to London, whether it was writing another boring paper, whether it was, clearing my diary to have a conversation with somebody, all of those things came together in a way that things don't come together in the natural world. In other words, our actions are pulled from the future by our sense of possibility, a future that doesn't exist in the natural world. And that's what makes actions different from other mere happenings.
So,
So that's
yeah.
sort of a bit of the argument. We
So it's
could
a
go on
little
much
bit of it's very
bit of the
complex
argument.
too, because the free will that's happening that you're describing is just those studies where they show that, your decision was made before you were able to really conceive of it, like you took action beforehand. It doesn't really explain away free will. It just means that there's a far more interesting question, is like what else is behind it and how much more complex is this subject? I feel like they're just too quick to conclude, right?
You're absolutely right. And if you take the example of Libet's studies, that basically the subject has to choose to when she moves her hand. And she has to time also the time when she makes the decision to move her hand. And shock, horror, we discover that the decision to move her hand took place after the brain had already prepared to move that hand. So it was the brain that was calling the shots. Well, that's nonsense. That's only the last 20 seconds in something that's in itself meaningless.
Hmm.
Let's stand back on this subject and remember, how did she get involved in the experiment? Well, she read about it in a newspaper. She thought she'd help these scientists because the little boy next door has got a little bit of trouble with his brain, and perhaps these clever brain scientists could help. And so she sets off the following morning, having, made sure that someone's looking after the childcare, drives to the laboratory, has a row with someone about her parking slot, finds a way in the laboratory, listens to what's going to be done to her, understands, and then consents to it. That's what's happening. It's not just a flick of the hand. It's something much more complex, something set out in time, something that consists of a sequence of possibilities, first envisaged and then actualized. So that's why Libet's experiments are totally irrelevant. And actually, to give Sapolsky credit, he also says that Libet type experiments, where you just look at someone moving their hand and look at brain activity, are totally irrelevant. He says that's the last, 30 seconds. What really matters is the background.
Mm.
Unfortunately, he embraces the background in his determinist picture as well. There's a
Yeah.
kind of kindness behind his determinists as well, because he said if people are not responsible for actions, we shouldn't be punishing them the way they are. And so at least he's trying to have a progressive attitude to punishment. I feel we can have a progressive attitude to punishment while still recognizing there's such a thing as free will.
Yeah, and maybe still having the ability to take responsibility for your actions within inside of the structure that we don't quite understand. There's still some form of morals and ethics, and that's where philosophy comes in, and it's so important, especially if you start writing away free will and you're creating, say, something like AI, and you have these supercomputing capacities, and you're creating this artificial intelligence, but you're looking at it as if it's just unconscious, unfolding technological progress that's mediated through this weird meat machine. And if you don't give yourself personal responsibility, I think you can create a sociopathic culture, which it's dangerous.
I totally agree with you. I mean, that to me is the worry of AI. Not that it'll ever become conscious, and we can talk about whether we'll ever have conscious AI. I don't think there will be, but that it can simulate consciousness and that it can, as it were, take over responsibilities that we have. We should be discharging ourselves. I mean, it's like you can imagine a war breaking out entirely, inverted commas, the decision made by machinery and, real suffering and really iniquitous things happening where nobody has taken responsibility for them. I think that's the worry of AI, not the notion that it'll ever become conscious. It's funny, there's a quite a good German philosopher called Thomas Metzinger. I don't know whether his name rings a bell,
Mm-mm.
but he says we should have a hold on any kind of possibility of creating conscious AI because most consciousness is uncomfortable. And can you imagine, should we be adding to the total of suffering in the world? And the answer is, of course not. Well, I don't agree with him. I don't think AI is ever going to become conscious. But it's an interesting thought that if there was a possibility of it becoming conscious, we should guess that possibility is going to mean that it's going to become uncomfortably conscious, and we shouldn't allow it to happen. But I don't think
Yeah.
it's going to happen.
Yeah, and even if we
It'll be-
don't, even if it doesn't become conscious, the people that are driving the technology, that's the more important piece is like, who are they and what are they orienting towards?
Exactly, their consciousness,
Yeah,
or
their
indeed their
consciousness is what
consciousness
I'd be
being
concerned
steered.
with. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That somehow you hand over inverted commas decision making to machinery, or you've
Hmm.
got bad actors whose power is greatly magnified by AI. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things with me is I try to be careful not to subscribe to any ideology, like to be identified with any form of thinking to some degree, because it keeps you locked into something that might be off, and that's driving all of your behavior. And I think that's one of the issues I'm seeing with humans is that we're so ideologically captured, and it can then drive our technology and our models of reality in a certain direction without it being correct, you know?
Yes. I guess if I have an ideology, and it's very broad, it is that each of us has a duty to make the world a better place for all of us. Clearly, we can't do that. We can only operate within a small parish, as it were. But I mean, that would be my only ideology. And as to how you achieve that, we can talk about all sorts of ways of achieving that. I mean, I'm a great fan of Rutger Bregman, who is a sensible utopian. Um, but so that's the nearest I get to ideology, I guess. We have a duty to make the world a better place than we found it. I mean, that is assuming, we're lucky enough not to be hungry, not to be politically persecuted, not to be assassinated young and so on, all of those things that
Hmm.
happen to too many of us. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a fan of being grateful first for the fact that you're having an experience, and then from there counting what could go wrong, and then fixing some of the things within your local field in the body and in the environment that you could maybe have an impact on. Like
Yeah.
like reciprocity is a good one. But I wanted to ask you about the imagination, because when you start to think about consciousness and then our ability to create and to have this incredible capacity to just have these weird experiences where you can close your eyes, or you can be in the shower, you can be riding your bike, and you have this incredible inner, or it could be outer. I don't know if we're like antennas and we're tapping into some sort of field of memory that's an akashic field. I don't like to go there because I don't know, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it's ours. It feels like we're little channels, or we're almost capturing something that's already been there, and that other people have had access to the same field. What do you think about the imagination?
Well, I mean, I think we're all so deep anyway. We're deep in time. I'm 78 years old. You're much, 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 much younger. But it seems to me we're so deep in time that we can draw on things that we have experienced and forget that we experienced them. Um, one of the strange things I find, I mean, is I can be thinking about something, a holiday my wife and I had 2 years ago. And then I think, why am I thinking about that? And I can trace the origin of that thought. And it's almost as if a water drop could go up a stream and find out where it was, 10 minutes ago.
Mm.
So, I mean, I feel that imagination is built into even our very banal everyday life. Obviously, then there's the great works of imagination, plays, and so on and so forth. But just in everyday life, and we have no explanation of that. We have no explanation of tense to time. The brain is a material object which exists in tenseless time. The brain at T1 is at T1, end of story. Raymond at T1 is thinking about T minus 100 and T plus 100, thinking about what happened last year and what's going to happen next year, and what presents we buy for somebody for Christmas or whatever. Um, so I don't feel I need to, although I'm sympathetic to what you said, need to look to a mysterious source. I am the most mysterious source of so much that one remembers.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even the idea of it's a funny conception. Like sometimes when you get really deep into that and you're like, what am I? And am I separate from this thing? You can't really separate self from universe, but that's I'm sure you've pondered that for many, many years.
I do feel quite separate from the universe. I mean, in that sense, the universe is around me. I am the center of the universe. You are the center of the universe, and so on. But you're right about the I. If you look at it hard, it evaporates to a little dot. But actually, when you think about it, really, Raymond Tallis's I, first of all, he synthesizes at any given moment sensations from hearing, seeing, as I'm talking to you, I can see your face, I can feel the pressure on my behind as I'm sitting on the seat, I can, feel my body and so on. So already we've got quite a bit of depth in my present moment. And then, of course, I'm drawing on the past and anticipating a future which draws on the past. And then I get an external scaffolding from others. If I come into my house, my wife doesn't call the police. I'm taken for granted. I'm recognized. If I go to the hospital to do a ward round, I'm recognized. So we have this external scaffolding. So suddenly this tiny little self, which is a sort of either a dot or a trickle of sensations, suddenly it becomes fatter and fatter and fatter. And I think I've got quite a lot of self, actually. And,
Yeah, definitely a lot of
and
self.
so have you, of course. I
Yeah,
mean,
39 books of self too. I imagine all the writing that you've done. That's more than a lot of people have ever even read. And the amount of reading that you do is probably incredible. And I was curious, who are some of your most influential writers and thinkers throughout time?
Gosh, what a really good question. I mean, in terms of, I've been hugely influenced by poets and novelists. I mean, the novelist I admire more than any other is James Joyce of Ulysses. And in one day, he hoovers up the richness of a world. It is just unbelievable. Um, Very few people can compete with him. So there's, and then there are poets. I'm particularly fond of Rainer Maria Rilke as a great poet. Um, I can recite, I'll spare you, of course, all sorts of stuff like that. So I admire poets. As for philosophers, there are philosophers I like engaging with, even though I don't agree with them. I mean, I've written a book on Heidegger. I'm in the process of writing another book on Heidegger. I don't agree with him, but he's a really interesting person to disagree with, even though sometimes engaging with him is like trying to do a can-can in a marsh, basically. Some of his language is so opaque. Um, Obviously, Kant is a very great, wonderful philosopher, Wittgenstein, and so on. There are lots and lots of philosophers, one engages with without necessarily agreeing with. In fact, it's almost disappointing to find a philosopher you totally agree with because you feel, oh dear, they've done the job already. Oh dear, have I become redundant? Luckily enough, there is enough erroneous philosophy to make sure one isn't redundant.
Is there
Well,
any book? Oh yeah, keep going if you don't mind.
No, I was going to say, even though you think, well, what is the point of arrival at philosophy? I'm 78 now, so I should really think about, I'm a thermodynamic freak. So, I mean, well, when is the point of arrival? What is arrival in philosophy? Is it arriving at a conclusion? Well, I haven't reached a conclusion. And clearly, showing how other people's philosophy is wrong isn't a point of arrival either way. Is there a vision you can inhabit? Well, the vision I inhabit is actually everyday life. So I don't have a clear idea, despite all the fat books, of what would count as having arrived in philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like you're just driven by a passionate curiosity. You just enjoy it, right?
I do, and I enjoy the polemic, disagreeing with people and agreeing with some people. And also, I think just Wittgenstein once said philosophy consists of assembling reminders for a purpose. And it's so wonderful just to remind oneself of the complexity of Ryan. I've just talked about his self, but I mean, it's just wonderful to remind oneself of the complexity of things. So it is a celebration. One will never get a full explanation, but one hopes to describe things in a most general way, but not so general it's become abstract, and to celebrate the incredible richness of the world we live in. And I can't get enough of it. I mean, a lot of people are sick of Raymond Tallis, but I can't get enough of Raymond Tallis. I want it to go on indefinitely.
No, I love that. I remember early on I was laying in those float tanks, and it was before I knew what meditation was. I hadn't even heard of the word, to be honest. I shoved myself in that tank, and I was somewhat uncomfortable being alone with my, because I was so enamored with all this thinking that was unconscious or something. And anyway, once I stepped away from it after a couple more floats, I was able to then become so curious about the complexity of the inner landscape that it was like, now I can't wait to go back to the float tank. And I was paying for 4-hour floats because it became this really beautiful mystery and something to get really curious about instead of trying to get away from it, which is what I think when you get into the root of suffering and the momentum of our culture, a lot of it stems from, I think, the inability to just confront reality. And it's like we're just busying ourselves. Do you agree?
Absolutely. To celebrate reality, to appreciate the richness of the supposedly ordinary, and there's nothing ordinary about the ordinary. I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. And I suppose that if philosophy has an ambition, but so does poetry and so on, it is the celebration of the absolutely general, the utterly ordinary, seeing it that it is absolutely extraordinary.
Mm.
So I'm thinking, I say to my wife Terry, I say, do you remember that restaurant in Greece 2 years ago? She said, yes. And do you remember then the waiter, dot, 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 as if we created suddenly a pop-up shop, from nothing. And it's as miraculous as swallows migrate and they come back to the same eaves of the same houses in the same village,
It's amazing.
we're doing the same thing. You know, basically, I can alight on a memory of 2 years ago, having looked straight through 100 Wednesdays and 100 Sundays to that kind of thing that one can do. Just ordinary capabilities are just unbelievable.
Yeah, you can blow your own mind at any moment if you just have the ability to just pay attention to what's happening. And I always
Exactly.
think, like, I was driving across the United States and I was on my way to a friend's house in California and I was listening to a podcast by James Hollis, who's like a Jungian analyst. And it was fascinating to be listening to this guy through space time while I'm driving in this little vehicle going 80 miles an hour. And I'm also having this giant inner landscape happening at the exact same time where I'm contemplating the nature of consciousness and I'm going 80 miles an hour. It's just like that's unbelievably complex. And it
Absolutely.
what I think it ends up doing is it boosts all of the elements of what it would be to feel awe and wonder, which I think is the most healing component of being a human being. So what you're saying is really resonating with me. And when I see suffering, especially mental health issues, I don't know how to relate to some of it. And sometimes I, of course, want to minimize it. So sometimes I feel like it's just lack of imagination or lack of perception. I'm not trying to put that responsibility onto those folks because it's far more complex and there's more nervous system and there's traumas and all this stuff. But sometimes it just requires to get out of your own head and to pay attention to how beautiful it all is and how complex it is.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, Heidegger famously says, basically, Gedenken is Gedanken. To think is to thank. And in that sense, one does realize that life is a gift. And, I don't believe in a giver who gave the gift. There's no God who did it. Who knows how I came about. But it is great to have this sense of the gift of life. And sort of,
I love that. Well, I always ask every guest, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
gosh, that is perhaps there's no such thing as ordinariness. That which is ordinary, commonplace, day to day, every day, in fact, is infinitely profound. And when you start unpacking it and unpacking the self that's unpacking it, basically you will discover extraordinary things. So, and that's in many ways what Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses does. It really just follows this chap, well, there's several characters, but the main character, Leopold Bloom, through just 16 hours of his life. And the richness is just amazing,
Mm,
sort of as he follows his stream of consciousness.
that's beautiful. That's a really beautiful statement right there. Yeah, how do I get people to find your new book when it comes out? Is that in November?
It's in September. Oh, thank you. Yes, and I've forgotten whether it's been published in America. It's usually co-published sometime by Columbia, I think, sometime. But it's Agenda. I'm not too sure about that. If there is American publisher,
Mm.
but it will be available in September in all good bookshops, and I'm launching it in actually having a launch in October hoping to get that my favorite disease, which is repetitive strain injury from signing copies of books.
And if you had to start somebody on some of your material, where would you think the average person should start? What book would you think they should start with?
Oh, well, thank you for asking that. I mean, probably Aping Mankind is the most broad. The most, as it were, sustainedly profound, if that's the right word, is the book on time, called Of Time and Lamentation.
Okay.
And if you're interested in freedom and impossible reality, which has the virtue of being much shorter than the other books. I mean,
Wow. And do you mind just sharing, how do you write? Like, do you wake up in the morning and have a ritual, or how does your writing process work?
when I was a doctor, I used to get up at about 5 and write for a couple of hours and then drive to the hospital. When I retired, I was able to write all day, and I do write every day. And I keep a notebook. I always have a notebook, so ready to write notes and transcribe the notes and so on. But the and the thing gradually comes together. You know, it's a bit like a baby assembling itself in utero.
Mm.
And the trouble is, by the time I've got to the third trimester of a book, I'm already thinking about the next one. And so, you know.
I love it. Yeah, so you're basically giving birth to it. It's developing in the womb. That's very neat.
Well, there's a kind of uterine infidelity, as it were, you know, sort of, yeah.
That's beautiful. Well, I really appreciate your time today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. This has been fun.
Oh, it's been an honor, and thank you. What an enjoyable conversation. Thank you, and all the best with your day job as well. I must say, I admire the courage and availability of people like your good self, you know, when our house goes on fire, you know, and all the other problems that one can encounter that you rescue us from. I really appreciate it. You know.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor to be able to do it.
Oh,
All right.
great. Oh,
Yeah.
nice to talk. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.